Well, it's April. Spring is here, and we're beginning to get those early indicators of what the next couple of months are going to bring as far as the market here in the District of Columbia. Now, ultimately, this is just going to be a snapshot. We know that this is going to be really an understanding of what the market, and truth be told, it's getting pulled in a couple different directions all at once. So what we're going to be looking at is not just the real estate trends, but maybe the federal policy, the job stability, rent behavior, all these things that are intersecting. Not to mention the fact that obviously there's a lot going on in the news, as there has been for since our last update nearly a year ago. But I like to have these little sessions in April as it starts to give us a better understanding of what we should be anticipating of the upcoming months. I mean, ultimately, many people sit on the sidelines during the winter months, and so as spring thaws, we have the green grass, leaves on the trees, and flowers abud. It's a good opportunity to get to know where things are going and generally get an understanding of what that spring outlook may look like. And so we all know that DC doesn't move like other markets, and right now that's more true than ever. Early years we've seen different dynamics in terms of the job opportunities, and we're going to expand upon that throughout this section. Now, like many, I ultimately want to save the questions and answers until the end. I'll cover a lot of information over the next couple of minutes, usually running about 20 to 30 minutes on the session. But with my years of experience and owners that we are regularly talking to, a lot of times we're having these conversations with our owners before the market fully shows the statistics and the data to support it. My name's Conrad Bennett. I've been a property manager working with independent owners throughout this city for many a year, many investors, many incidental, accidental landlords, but ultimately being able to give them guidance of to what to expect and how to transition their properties, sometimes as a new investment or their personal residence, to a rental property can take some time. It can take some energy. And of course, numbers have a big impact on it. So over this session, I hope to be able to give a good picture of what that might entail and what you should be able to expect. Um, with the years of experience, I've seen many a market and things have ebbed and flowed over the years. And quite frankly, we're 6 years removed from those early days of the pandemic, and a lot of similar conversations have had over the last decade, especially over the last 5 years. So I'm going to give you all a market snapshot, like where we're at with some of the sales standing today versus what we've seen over the last couple of years. I'm going to break down what has had an impact on the market, like I'd alluded to in previous sessions, that Doge layoffs, the return to the office, that little push-pull dynamic, as well as the federal uncertainty, because ultimately I've heard many a times that DC was resistant to economic downturns, but at the same time, without the federal employment, that certainly can have an impact. As far as the rental market deep dive, I want to talk about what rents we're seeing, what vacancy, some new supply, and ultimately some of the tenant migrations, and how that impacts not only DC as a whole, but neighborhoods independently, because there certainly can be a hyper local performance right now in some neighborhoods, as well as the suburbs, and what we can expect going into the late spring, early summer. And then, of course, I'll leave this open for a little discussion at the end and answer some questions if there's anything that people wish to ask or we could potentially take offline. So with that said, we're looking at a lot going on in the sales inventory. Over the last year, projected for 2026, we're anticipating rough decline, and it's marginal. A couple, 0.5% to 1% isn't significant, but at the same time, we've definitely seen these numbers ebb and flow over the last year and a half, right? And so you can definitely see the Q2 trend back at the beginning of middle of last year around this time. Those numbers did begin to pop a little bit. Lots of multi-million-dollar homes certainly had an impact on that. But overall, the numbers have been trending in the same direction. Now, of course, that also has an impact on the average days on market. We definitely have been seeing places taking a little longer to go under contract, but not unreasonably so. So if you're looking at the larger picture, 45 to 70 days to be able to get an offer on a listing is not unimaginable. But we also are seeing that the active listings year over year have had an increase. Now, I wouldn't say that it's a huge surge. I've seen other statistics that reflect that it has been relatively stable over the time. But going into the spring market, especially as we get the seasonality of it, April, May, June, ultimately is going to have a big push because that just is the seasonality of the sales and rental market for that matter. DC certainly does experience a lot of seasonality in the market, and that's not new. That's always been the factor, and it's only a handful of times we've seen those seasons shift, or at least the volume of activity shift because of the seasons. Now, one factor that ultimately does come into play is going to be that some owners are, in fact, selling their properties below the list price, potentially tied directly to the average days on the market, or the push to be able to get things done. But that has a big impact, especially for those owners that have bought in the last 5 to 10 years, 5 years specific, especially with the lower interest rates. They may have potentially have paid more than what the current market is necessarily on because they had great interest rates, they might have been able to afford more. And of course, many should recall that in that late 2020 or late 2021, there was a lot of activity in the market sales wise. And so they are beginning to see that now. Also, a lot of development, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, because that has too slowed over the last years. In fact, one statistic I read even coming into this meeting and this webinar was an article about how the development and breaking ground is at an all-time 15-year low. All right. So it's not that things aren't selling. The inventory still exists. There certainly has been a little strain on the condo market where the majority of that inventory has been. But at the same time, priced right is going to be a trend because things will move both on the sale and rental side when they're priced appropriately. So people ask what has had an impact, right? And of course, when we talked about this last year, the Doge effect was true, and the government downsizing has had an impact. That federal disruption has had a lot fewer jobs available for the number of people that tend to come to DC looking for that federal employment. And so when we talk about that push and pull, not only is there a shortage of job available right now, and of course there had been a handful of, a significant number of federal layoffs that didn't have as significant of an impact on DC specific from the statistical perspective, but it had a domino effect on supporting industries, especially some non-profits or other government agencies that were not directly tied to the cuts. But they do have an impact. And so when owners are going through that, trying to figure out what to do with their home, many of them had in fact turned to renting when they no longer had positions in the local area. Now, countering that, though, has been some of this return to the office mandates, bringing residents back to the urban core. And it does go to show that the overwhelming majority of the country is still flocking to urban sources. I'm going to have a statistic a little later, a map to share with you about where residents are moving from and moving to. But ultimately, there is a significance to that urban core. And so whether or not it makes sense from a time versus money perspective is something that many residents, owners, and tenants alike, buying or renting, still have the same decisions to be able to make in terms of what is the best for them. So we did have in February 2025, DC pending sales were down, slowest February since 2008. But at the same time, we also have seen a handful of more listings coming on these last couple of weeks. And so that's the beginning indicator of where things will go, and great opportunity to get that overview of what is to come these next couple of months. Now, since there has been a more competitive market, it is not unrealistic for sellers to begin and expect paying some of those closing costs. there has been more room for negotiation, and ultimately, for many, being able to make a deal work makes sense. And this doesn't necessarily spell out how much of the concession, but anticipate negotiating to make sure that things go through. But there is certainly that uncertainty. And so this dynamic between buying versus renting is going to be true. And seeing as renting is a lot less of a commitment than purchasing, the statement that I got from a TTR agent, a broker recently about people not knowing if they're going to have a job tomorrow, it's a true factor in determining and a lot of uncertainty that can contribute to these overwhelming decisions. But private sector is still driving a lot of this regional job growth. I've definitely been seeing that offsetting a lot of the government employment that we've seen in years past. And while DC may be one of the only mid-Atlantic market that may be seeing a price decline this upcoming year, it is marginal and more of a reset than necessarily a position change. So if we're going to be looking at the big picture going into it, we hit the ground running, we know where we're at, and this is beginning heading into the spring. So we can start making better decisions with better context, right? So before we go into the specifics of I'm sorry, the usual drivers are still there, but they've been a little disrupted, right? So the rental market snapshot on the opposite end of the spectrum. Rents have been marginally adjusted. I mean, I've seen statistics, 0.5% to a couple percent, but there had been a lot of new supply in Noma, the Navy Yard, and that has essentially begun to soften some of that rent growth in those neighborhoods. But the apartment construction boom is at the end. Permits have been dropping off, and like I said earlier, there has been a 15-year low in terms of new construction this year. That's offsetting a lot of the incidental landlords that are introducing new housing to the market. And while the population had been growing, we haven't necessarily seen those still numbers coming to the city just yet. It's something that we're going to continue to monitor. And as kids start graduating from school in these upcoming months, we tend to see them start shopping prior to that mid-May move date. So May, June tend to be some of our most popular months, including July. But seasonality of it, most will be settled by August, anticipating job starts in September, or maybe relocating kids to schools that will be starting late August and early September. And so I mentioned it a couple of times with those accidental landlords. There definitely has been an up of increased listings, like those condo owners that haven't been able to sell in the other months. Ultimately, if you're no longer living there and you are not selling the property for what you're looking for, I don't generally find too many owners that want to leave the property vacant for a prolonged period of time. So renting is the great opportunity for you to generate some income to offset your expenses, but more importantly, keep that property occupied, because we don't really like dealing with vacant units. There's too much that can go wrong, and no eyes being put on it can become problematic. I just had a conversation with an owner that had experienced just that, was not checking in on the property very often. And, between the heat and the AC that we've had the last couple of weeks, created some problems that went undetected and ultimately became more problematic. So just be mindful that keeping occupied is an important thing, and checking in on it periodically goes a long way. We also recognize that tariffs have had an impact on the construction costs, and of course, the war that now has a ceasefire is going to have an impact on gas prices and also some other importing expectations. So there is an expectation that there will be fewer units coming online as a whole going into the next couple of months. So hopefully, and anticipating, that's going to start absorbing some of the current inventory that had been sitting for a little while. I got to point out the vacancy rate, though, because as of May 2025, and I think that this may be slightly higher now statistically, we're generally trying to hover around 5%. In fact, For our clients, we are just at that mark. Whereas nationally and regionally, I've definitely seen numbers that have been significantly higher and creeping into the mid-teens, which is a good amount of inventory in a comparison to years past where we've been generally between 3, 4, 5% vacancy rates. All right. And a big factor specific to DC is the number of households that do in fact rent. It always has been a renter's market for the most part, meaning that there are more people that rent in the District of Columbia than own and reside in their homes. It's always hovered around that 60% mark. And over the past years, it had shifted a little bit in either direction, but the overwhelming majority of the residents in the District of Columbia and the majority of the suburbs are close-in suburbs are renters. So it does speak to the opportunity of taking advantage of some of these sales prices as they are low, finding tenants, and being able to keep these as investment properties. Now, of course, that also becomes related to the neighborhoods, which is going to be one of my next slides. So when we're looking at the overall dynamic, we ultimately have also seen a intriguing statistic, and I read an article recently generally about how renters are staying longer, and it's not just homeowners that are beginning to feel locked in with the interest rates and where they're at and the affordability. But next session, we're going to talk about lease renewals and our strategy to retain good tenants, making sure that you're working on a good timing and getting the value out of it. But I bring this up because there's a new, or not necessarily new, but a phrase that I've been using a lot more recently, but there's a lock-in effect. Lots of tenants are finding themselves stuck because of the capacity to, both with the limited affordability and the limited supply and the higher rents, that they're actually staying longer than we've been used to having. Over the last, I don't know, probably decade or more, most tenants have generally been staying about 5.5 years on average with us. And we're seeing that creeping up to about 6.5 years. So that's a full additional year of residency for the most part. And so it's something to keep in mind. And of course, I always preach to our clients that the longer the tenants stay, the more you're going to make. And so I want to dig into those retention approach and our policies and our suggestions to our clients going into this next quarter. We'll dig more into what that looks like. So where are people going? What's the migration looking like? You know, oddly enough, one of the things that we do track is how many people of our residents that leave are actually staying in the District of Columbia. More often than not, we have the majority, over 50%, are just kind of moving from one neighborhood to another, whether or not it's upgrading to something a little larger or changing from a neighborhood that they may just want to try a different space, maybe closer to work, closer to friends, more nightlife, what have you. But for right now, what we're ultimately seeing is a migration from some neighborhoods to the more tried and true. West End, Georgetown, DuPont certainly get a lot of activity. And from a leasing perspective, seeing as things are taking a little longer, we've definitely seen a handful of places that usually lease up in about 3 days, taking a few weeks. But at the same time, the tried and true neighborhoods have certainly had a lower vacancy rate than some of the more developing neighborhoods. So this is something you need to keep an eye on. And of course, with that and the vacancy and the longer time to lease, it also has an impact on the pricing. Currently, West End, on that, Peace Street between DuPont and Georgetown is definitely seeing some of the highest rents currently in the area. And of course, that also has that impact of pushing some residents out to Alexandria and Arlington, Silver Spring, where they're close but not in city limits. And that push-pull is going to start to define how we see this upcoming next few months. Now, for those residents that are leaving, this is an interesting map that I like to refer to every now and again, just in terms of who's coming and where they're going. But what it's very intriguing to see that our Baltimore ranks high on both where people are going and where people are coming from. I find it especially interesting because back in 2020, when we did lose a good number of the population, a majority of them were going, the residents that left us went to Baltimore and Richmond, essentially the second cities. And that was a trend that was seen throughout the rest of the United States as well. But now we're also beginning to see some going, but many also coming back from Baltimore. We also see a lot coming from New York and Philadelphia, but there's definitely going to be a lot that are returning from some other cities. You can see most of them have a lot of the same relation: Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Dallas, Houston. Austin has had a decline just because there's so much inventory, but we all ultimately tend to see a lot coming from New York and Boston, moving a little further south, coming from Chicago. But the regional aspect, moving from DC to Baltimore or Baltimore to DC, is still true as it was 6 years ago. All right. So, what's the summer outlook going to look like? Right now we're forecasting, and this isn't data pulled from Bright MLS, the regional multiple listing service, but the DC market, from a sales perspective, is anticipating that the prices will dip a little bit, fraction percent. Median sales prices are going to remain about the same, going to the 617, but we also anticipate that there will be a volume increase because a lot of sideline buyers are going to be re-entering the market this spring. We anticipate that the mortgage rates are going to be averaging at that 6.15, which is down from that peak that we'd seen this past year. Still under the historical averages for mortgages, but not as close as the 3% that we saw a couple of years ago. And we are going to see a lot of listings, and this going to be a fast moving spring, basically from now through June, for a lot of the inventory. But we do anticipate that the average market is properties are going to stay on market for a while this upcoming spring. So be patient with the listings, but at the same time, this helps plan it appropriately. For those that do shift and want to kick the can down the road on the sales conversation, rentals are a great opportunity to do so. We do see that construction pipeline is slowing. There are going to be fewer units coming to the market in the months and years ahead. We do anticipate that vacancy rate is going to soften. I do think that it will be hyper local. We're going to have to talk about how that's going to impact you and your neighborhood. We have to look at the number specific, what your competition is, what places rented for, what people are asking versus what they got. Ultimately, all of that helps strategically place your property for sale or rent in a competitive market. But be ready for people to negotiate as it stays on the market a little longer. But we will have some pretty strong demand. We have not had a tremendous interest in some of the larger properties. A lot of the 1 bedrooms, small 2 bedrooms, and even efficiencies have been pretty sustainable. But again, it's hyper local. It's region by region, neighborhood by neighborhood. And of course, we do have a lot of the suburban neighborhoods that are commuter friendly. Getting from Arlington or Tysons downtown can have an impact. Now, one thing that I've read, of course, is about the stay at work dynamic, work from home dynamic rather, and whether or not that is something that we're going to want to do and keep an eye on, because geographic flexibility has been offered by that remote work. And then, of course, when you couple that with affordability, a lot of this migration pattern in the recent years has been very closely watched, and it has probably slowed a lot of the big moves from region to region that people have seen, that we typically do get here in the district, flocking to DC as our nation's capital. So I only and will continue to advise owners to price right. Make sure that your upgrades, your finishes, putting things in place that are going to make your property more attractive, be mindful of what people are looking for in terms of their leases and their lease options. And so you're prepared to work with them so that you can help still secure the best quality applicant for your property at that time. Obviously, from things that we need to continue to watch, you know, Trump's policies, the shocks, the department changes, the shutdowns, these ultimately are going to remain a wild card. Tariffs have continued to be a ongoing conversation. That federal workforce stabilization, I do think that things are going to get leveled, and even there are conversations about some departments being rehired. We do anticipate there being a home sales double-digit increase, NAR, the National Association of Realtors. And of course, we've already had the cherry blossom season come and go, but we're still in that area of the year where things do begin to spike. And this is something that we're going to continue to watch, is that tech sector growth, especially in Northern Virginia. And it very well may offset the federal contracting, though these are also conversations we had when Amazon's Q2 came to the region and the impacts that had. Right. So here are takeaways, and I'll open it up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, certainly throw them into the question and answers, and I'll be able to get to them shortly. But we do anticipate that there will be a price decline, right? Just because the demand remains high but resilient, despite that federal disruption. The inventory has increased, so you have to be mindful of that. That's rebalancing the buyer and renter opportunities and therefore expectations. This is the time of the year that most people will be bringing their places online for sale or for rent, which is the best opportunity in years for both those buyers and those sellers. And we got to keep that hyper local knowledge. It's essential. So we need to look at the performance in each and every single zip code to be able to give some guidance. And of course, pricing correctly, offering flexibility, investing in some upgrades is a great opportunity for you to add value to your property so that you're able to ask and probably get a higher rent, because when your property is different than the rest on the block, it does give you that opportunity to do so. So, how are we doing on questions? I got one.
Yeah.
Am I the only experiencing a huge echo? Oh, I'm sorry. I did not know that. I didn't notice.
I think that's the only question we got.
All right. Well, that's surprising. No questions?
Oh, there's one that just popped in. How do these trends impact affordable housing like Naylor Garden?
Well, ultimately pricing a property can have an impact. And so, affordable housing, I've always felt that the independent land homeowner that is leasing out their property is offering the majority of the affordable housing stock in this region, and maybe even nationwide, just in terms of how people go about the pricing. And our owners generally are 100% invested in that property. So working with applicants to be able to find a good price that makes sense and is in line with market conditions has a big impact. Now, affordable housing, from the bigger scope of things, I would say that overwhelmingly, pricing it right is going to have that big impact.
All right, next question. Has EJF seen an increase in voucher applicants in demand?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I would say that it is neighborhood by neighborhood, property by property, but there are definitely a lot of great residents being secured through the housing program, especially with the conversations about not only what they're able to get, but it's a big impact when we don't have market rate tenants that are applying for properties. But I would say that the pricing and the inspections, I think, as something I'd covered on a previous session, just to make sure that the property is going to meet compliance standards, is a big aspect of making sure that you're able to not only not only offer it to all potential applicants, but be able to get through the housing inspection licensing process and actually have those residents move in. Recently, there's been a little conversation about what what the security deposit payment looks like, and we're still digging into that.
All right, next question. What are the best platforms to advertise your home as a homeowner?
Uh-huh. We've always felt that casting a really large net goes a long way. So we market out to nearly 150 different websites, making it available in the MLS to other real estate agents that may have clients. Zillow Rental Network certainly goes a long way, but I've been doing this for quite a while, and we've seen some more popular listing opportunities come and go, including back in the day when we had the Washington City paper online. At 3 o'clock on Tuesdays through Craigslist. But I would say it's just as important to have good marketing material, having the property priced right, as it is to use those different sources. But there's so many internet listing services, ILSs, that you can utilize. And I'd say try them all, get the visibility out there. I know that we do. But again, it goes back to the fact that you need to have the property in good condition. You then are able to capture great photos that you can share online. Because let's just agree that I'd say that nobody's going to pound the pavement anymore if they don't like what they see online.
Next question. Have you seen a decrease in demand in Northeast? What is this related to?
Um, I mean, I've seen a decrease in demand in a handful of different neighborhoods. It wouldn't necessarily just be Northeast because there's pockets. I think we can also say that we've had some neighborhoods in Northwest DC and the Southeast, Southwest that all have had a little decline. It could be accessibility, it could be pricing, it could be the neighborhood and the feel. But we do see a lot of inventory in some of those neighborhoods, and so you got to tie those correlations together to be able to look at the big picture, to make sure that you're in line with what people are willing to pay, right? I mean, heck, I'd love to make every client $10,000 a month if I could, but truth be told, we're going to get what somebody's willing to pay for it. So um, take the first step, because when we're dissecting what will help to get a place leased up, we go with the basics, which is first going to be the condition of the property. Second is going to be the marketing, the content, location, frequency of those ads. And then we talk price, because if we know that it looks good and shows well, then price is that next conversation.
Can you speak to selling 2 through 4 units in DC? Are investors still buying?
Yeah, I mean, as a broad stroke, I would say that investors are still buying. One of the statistics I'd come across in this preparation for this was the number of people that are buying all cash deals, and being bullish in this market. And I think that it is a great opportunity for some buyers out there, but it depends, is always my favorite answer. You're going to have to dissect what you're looking to sell, understanding the dynamic, the tenant's condition in which they're keeping it, the rents that they're receiving, overall condition of the property. So yes, I think there are great opportunities, and I do believe that units are selling and investors are buying, but you got to dig in to see what the numbers are going to look like.
All right, that's all the questions for now. Oh, wait, there have been a couple more. Sorry.
Mm.
How will the trends in affordable housing like Naylor Gardens impact the sale of Naylor Gardens to a new investor or developer?
I'm not as familiar with Naylor Gardens' overall picture, so that would be something I cannot expand upon. I do know that regionally there have been a lot of big developments that have sold. So again, it kind of depends to and goes along with the conversation about what the overall picture looks like. So look into the numbers, looking into the just recently read something about being able to get financing when there's high delinquencies in buildings. And so the Fannie Mae Freddie Mae guidelines that are going to have an impact on that. So, ultimately it has to be the big picture, and I'm not sure that I can say what that would look like right now. I'd have to do some more research. Um, Uptick, another question, uptick in rental scams. Yeah, they've been there. They have been present. They do exist, and people do take advantage. I would say that you have to scrutinize your marketing content, making sure that you are watermarking your photos. I think we've talked about that in previous sessions to help reduce the potential for your listings to be taken and turned around. But then we also have seen some applicants that have false criteria or credentials and are able to navigate the system. So I would definitely make sure that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's when you're going through the application process to make sure that everything lines up.
Okay, what are the license requirements if you have only one or two units you'd like to rent out?
You're operating a business and in the district, you need to have a license to do so. Each property, and I guess we'll have to determine if that is a independent unit and would be a single family rental license, or if it's a duplex and you're going to need to get a C of O and a multi-unit license or a 2-unit rental. But either way, yes, you do need to be licensed if you're renting out your properties in the District of Columbia. And if you're currently living there and you're thinking about making a change to having it as a rental, that's a good thing to start the conversation sooner than later because the process can take a couple of weeks at a minimum and sometimes longer. So I'd be happy to talk to you if that's something that you're looking for help on or looking to explore.
How is Adams Morgan doing as a rental market these days?
I'd say Adams Morgan's been pretty good. I mean, early pre-pandemic, I think we saw a migration from the red line to more of the green line properties, meaning just, the Connecticut Avenue corridor, straight down through towards like the Columbia Heights, down to the Southwest waterfront. But early days of the pandemic, it shifted back to the red line. I think that the mentality of restaurants being closed and not having that social outlet moved more towards more greenery, which you'll find in upper northwest and northeast and even some areas of southeast. But Adams Morgan, I think, has been pretty resilient, though I think that most of the pricing has been relatively flat. And if there has been a decline, I don't think it's too significant, not that I've seen from the numbers perspective.
What do you think of the rental price suggestions that Zillow and others are able to generate?
You know, I take it with a grain of salt. I definitely look at that and a few other sources to be able to kind of triangulate and come up with what makes sense. You know, I I would have to look at it as a case by case basis to see what else is out there and do that comparison. Generally have never just focused on what the Zillow estimated pricings or the estimates were, sales or rentals. I think there's a bigger picture out there that needs to be dissected a little bit.
Can you please speak again about the projected decline in 2026?
I mean, just seasonality of the market had put a lot of inventory on these past few months, and we want to see that absorbed. But just general supply and demand expectations. When there's more supply and less demand, I think people do inherently make price adjustments. Often those get corrected as we enter into the spring and summer markets, or at least offset. So one thing that we ultimately work with our owners on is trying to get their turnovers and their leasing periods to kind of align with what's going to be more productive and try to avoid those months where it is less. Now, life happens and people need to do things at certain times. And so having conversations about that initial lease up and how long those leases will be and when they're going to be up for renewal or extension is a big part of it. But in the end of the day, I think that the existing inventory and the idea that there will probably be more units being added to the market, even though they're not coming through development, will probably have an impact on what's out there and potentially have that impact on the pricing. And all you need is one person down the street to make a drastic change that can have an impact on everyone.
All right, a couple more questions. Have the increase in criminal activity impacted on some areas? Which ones?
Yeah, I mean, it can. It certainly does. And I think that downtown has had an impact. I'm closely monitoring the mayor's suggestion to impose some curfews, and it's not necessarily crime that has an impact, but also presence. But, I would say that the Chinatown area and Penn Quarter has had an impact over the last couple of years. But overall, I think that it has been getting a little better. I would have to dig into the neighborhood by neighborhood gist. So if there's one specific, I'm happy to dig into that a little bit.
Any thoughts on the Fruman bill? Should voucher landlords be concerned?
Bremen's bill's been sitting for a while. I don't know how far it's going to go, and I haven't heard any updates on it in a bit. Ultimately, I don't know that voucher landlords should be concerned. I would ultimately want to make sure that you got good quality tenants, and I think retention is probably going to be a big conversation. But obviously, what you're able to get from the housing program is an impact. So again, that's going to be neighborhood by neighborhood, but I haven't heard that moving in quite a while. And I'm trying to think through when I last heard it being reintroduced. I'd have to double check.
All right, last question. Are you seeing less students rent off campus?
I haven't noticed that being an impact. I still think that you're going to have students that are looking for off-campus housing. I mean, overwhelming majority of GW residents do over the years. I think we've tracked what the on-campus versus off-campus housing options have been for GW, Georgetown, Catholic, UDC. I mean, I have not seen any change in that. American University, just to name a few.
Okay, sorry, one more popped in. This will be our last question.
All right.
How are properties in Petworth doing?
Doing well. I think we've just leased up a couple and added a few new to the market. They have taken a little while to lease, but ultimately, I think that the numbers have been working out well for our owners. Again, factoring in seasonality, any of the places that came on in January and February probably will not get the same numbers as we will in April and May. But yeah, I haven't. Petworth has been holding for the most part. In fact, I think may be doing better than Columbia Heights from a vacancy period perspective. All right. Well, if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to talk offline. My information's here. Feel free to reach out. You can give me a call or text me at that 803-7200. And of course, through our website, you're always able to submit a request for more information. Many of the pages do allow you to submit it. But ultimately, if there's anything else I can do to help you directly, and that has an impact on you or your rental property, I am more than happy to continue the conversation. So next month, we're going to be earlier in the month. I think we're aiming for that first full week to talk about what we put into the efforts to keep and retain our good quality tenants. And I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation soon. So if there's anything else I can add from this, I'll bring it up then. Thank you all for joining. Looking forward to talking soon.